Joining us again, I'm happy to say, is Jeff Weiner, Orlando Sentinel Court Reporter. Hello, Jeff.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Please, thank you. I know. We know how busy you are. Okay, morning, I guess, was taken up with the police officer and the people who arrived on the scene, testifying, and the body. The jury saw pictures of the body, the bullet wound, and heard testimony from the officer who thought he heard gurgling sounds, tried to cover up the wound. I mean, is that basically what the morning consisted of?
Actually, it wasn't until the afternoon that we heard from the officer who arrived on scene and tried to perform CPR and close the wound. This morning, we heard from not an officer, but an employee of the Sanford Police Department who basically helped George Zimmerman set up and run the neighborhood watch in his community.
Okay, let's talk about that first then. Yeah.
Sure. Well, basically, she testified that, one of the first things the prosecution asked her about was, do you tell people that they can follow suspicious people? She said absolutely not. Then when the defense started questioning her, they started bringing out some positive things about George Zimmerman. She said, that he was very professional in his interactions with her, that she actually recommended to him that he get involved with another program they have that actually involves citizens patrolling. Basically, it was kind of a mix, her testimony. On the one hand, if the jury is thinking that Zimmerman followed Trayvon Martin, she made clear that neighborhood watch people are told not to do that. But on the other hand, she did have some nice things to say about Zimmerman, and in fact indicated, though the jurors never saw this email, that he sent a nice email about her to the police chief and that she liked that and things along those lines.
Well, of course, even if he followed Trayvon Martin, which we know he was doing, that doesn't speak to the issue. I mean, all this to me is dressing, because it doesn't speak to the issue really of, was he assaulted by Trayvon Martin, and did he defend himself? And that's what it's going to come down to, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, she obviously was not an eyewitness.
Right.
The next person who was called was the HOA president, who also not an eyewitness.
That's the homeowner association, correct?
Right, exactly. And basically, the point of both of their testimony from the state's perspective seemed to be to establish that the neighborhood watch was Zimmerman's idea, that it was something that he was very passionate about. It kind of fits into this entire concept that they're trying to get across of profiling of him, being some kind of the phrase that's been used and was discussed before the opening, wannabe cop. I think it's that type of mentality that they're driving at.
And by the way, from what I don't know that this has come up in testimony yet, but George Zimmerman was not on patrol when he followed, not on watchman duty when he followed Trayvon Martin, or got out of the car and made the call to police. He was on his way to a drugstore, correct?
Yes, he was on his way, I believe, to Target.
Yeah.
And that was mentioned that has not come out in testimony yet, but it was mentioned in the opening statement by the defense attorney.
Right,
so
yeah.
Jurors have heard that, but not from a witness yet.
All right, now there's another issue at hand here. And well, let's get to the police officer and the showing of the body. I know that the Trayvon Martin's father walked out when they showed the pictures of the wound and everything. What was the purpose of the police officer and the man who tried to seal the wound? And I mean, what is that just like accounting for the whole incident, start to finish?
Yeah, it's fairly typical to see the prosecution, call first responders, call people who were on the scene and who, were involved in the attempted life-saving process, and to show crime scene photos. It's pretty typical for a trial. I mean, the state has to establish everything. They have to establish that a shooting happened, that someone was killed. They have to, show they certainly would expect, the jurors would expect them to show the basic evidence. But it was emotional testimony. Certainly, some of the jurors seemed to be kind of uncomfortable with. There were a lot of graphic photos that were shown, and it was definitely the most dramatic moment, I would say, of the trial today.
All right, let's skip ahead now to what the prosecutors and the defense are differing on, and that is the previous 911 calls, or calls made to police by George Zimmerman. I think if I'm not mistaken, over an 8-year period, we're talking about 50 calls, which would be something like 6 calls a year, which is like one every 2 months on the average. And the defense doesn't want those in. The prosecution does, correct?
Yes, the prosecution has identified several calls that they want to introduce from not from quite as long a time period as all of those calls took place. It's basically several months before the shooting, where they played the calls in court today when the jury was not in the courtroom. Basically, it's George Zimmerman calling and reporting people as suspicious. I believe all the calls we heard today, it was young African-American men that he was reporting. Basically, just used some of the similar language to what he used in the call reporting Trayvon Martin as suspicious. Said he didn't know what one of the guys' deal was, things along those lines. And again, that goes to the state trying to show, that this was a mentality of his. The prosecutor, when he was arguing, said that the state wanted to show that Zimmerman had been growing frustrated by the fact that he kept reporting people, but that they weren't necessarily always being caught.
Now, was there any obscenities? Did he use any racially insensitive words? And was he usually asked whether or not, as in the case of Trayvon Martin, although NBC edited that tape, was he asked if the suspect was what race they were, or did he just say black guy? And if he did say black man or black guy, was there anything more derogatory than that?
No, there was nothing derogatory, and it's a good point you mentioned in your question that he didn't in these calls, as opposed to the one from the night of the shooting, use any foul language, no profanity in them. I think that on all the instances where he mentioned someone's race in the calls that he was prompted. I mean, it's a fairly standard question for a dispatcher to ask.
Sure.
Black, white, or Hispanic. That they usually ask that, and that seems to be what generally happened when he called. So the calls, if it wasn't part of this case, I don't think they would seem in any way out of the ordinary. Obviously the quantity is higher than most people probably place, but it really is all about the state trying to put them into the context of the shooting. Yeah.
Sure, and of course, the defense will then bring up how many robberies there were during that time period in that complex, and he was charged with being a watchman and was frustrated with that. But let me ask you this: if they're allowed to bring that in, and by the way, we're talking to Jeff Weiner of the Orlando Sentinel here on the Steve Malzberg Show. He was at the Zimmerman trial. If they bring that in, then can't the defense argue? And I don't know if they could argue in direct relationship if this is admitted, but can't then the defense argue that Trayvon, based on what they know of him, was into fighting and rough fighting, bare-fisted fighting, that kind of thing, and that's exactly what George Zimmerman claims happened to him. So can't they then argue that that's admissible and that's pertinent if the judge decides that this is pertinent and admissible?
Well, that's the thing is, you would think that if one person's past is relevant to the shooting, then the other person's past is relevant to the shooting. At least that seems to be something that I'm hearing from a lot of people watching the case. It really is more about, from what I understand from talking to lawyers about it, whether or not the stuff about Trayvon Martin's past comes in, more has to do with how the state portrays him. In other words, if the state puts on
that he's an angel,
his parents, that he's an angel, or that he was never in trouble, then the defense has a right to counter that and bring in some of this evidence. It's not necessarily about how the state portrays Zimmerman or what they get in on Zimmerman. It's really more about how the state portrays Trayvon Martin.
That's good. What do we expect tomorrow? We got 30 seconds or so left. What's tomorrow?
We still haven't heard from the medical examiner. We still haven't heard from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement on DNA testing. And
well, here's a question, real quick. Does it matter that, I mean, if you take someone by the hair, let's say, and push their head into the ground, does that mean DNA definitely comes on your hand?
No, and that was actually one of the questions that the defense asked on cross-examination.
Okay, that's good to know. I don't have time to pursue it. If we're fortunate enough to talk to you tomorrow, we'll pursue that because people are making a big deal about that. And I said, so what? You may not get DNA on your hands. All right, thank you very much.